Hello. Hi, how's everyone doing tonight? Um, Getting a little late started, which is nothing new. Hey Ace, how's it going? Long time no see. Um, so we're just about to dive into chapter 17 of this book. um, I don't know. I don't remember what was happening last time. But I'm just gonna probably go ahead and take a gander at some of the earlier pages and oh yeah, Natasha was begging to know what was for dessert at her name day party. I'm 69 pages into the book and they're having pineapple ices. Pineapple ices for dessert. I haven't been able to catch any of your streams. That was some light reading. Yes. Some light reading. Well, thank you for joining. Um I'm starting chapter 17. If you'd like some chapter summaries, nice. If you'd like some character or chapter summaries, I think that links in the my information there. Hey Kevin, welcome. Tell me if the music's too loud or not. So, Natasha's name day party. What's happening? They all ate dinner. They all made a big scene about dessert. Everyone thought it was cute or funny or weird or both. So, let's just get this party going even more. Card tables were set up and partners arranged for Boston, and the Count's guests proceeded to one of the two drawing rooms, the sitting room or the library. As he fanned out his cards, the Count found it hard to keep awake. He usually had a nap after dinner, and this made him prone to laugh at anything. The young people, at the Countess's instigation, gathered round the clavichord and harp. Julie went first by common request, performing a short theme and variations on the harp. Then she joined the other young ladies in inviting Natasha and Nikolai to sing. They were known for their musical ability. Natasha was being treated by everyone as an adult, which made her feel proud but also rather shy. She's 13. Russian party, yes. Wishing I had a pineapple ice. Dude, I wish I had pineapple ice too. I just wish I had a pineapple to eat. um, I might. There's going to be a delivery at my door at some point. I may have to go to the door and pick it up. I might not. It may not happen. Anyways. What shall we sing? She asked. The spring, answered Nikolai. Come on then, quick! Over here, Boris, said Natasha. Where's Sonia gone? She looked around, saw that her companion was not in the room, and ran out to find her. She raced up to Sonia's room, but her friend wasn't there, so Natasha ran to the nursery. She wasn't there either. Natasha knew she must be out in the corridor, sitting on the chest. That chest in the corridor was a place of sorrow for the females of the younger generation of the House of Rostov. Yes, there she was, face down on the chest, squashing her filmy pink party dress on their old nanny's dirty striped feather mattress. Her face was buried in her tiny fingers, and her bare little shoulders were convulsed with sobbing. Natasha's face, glowing from the day's excitement, changed at once. Her eyes narrowed, her broad neck quivered, and her mouth turned down at the corners. I'm trying to picture all of that happening. I'm trying to picture like Natasha doing all that, and I'm getting this like body horror image. Natasha's face, glowing from the day's excitement, changed at once. Her eyes narrowed, her broad neck quivered, and her mouth turned down at the corners. Sonia, what's wrong? What happened? Ooh. See? Ooh, if it even shows up. Can't even see it. Can't even read this. Sonia, what's wrong? What's happened? Ooh. I think it's supposed to be like, or calming Sonia down. And Natasha with her large mouth gaping, which made her look quite ugly, howled like a baby for no reason, just because Sonia was crying. Sonia tried to look up, tried to answer, but she couldn't, and she buried her face deeper than ever. Still crying, Natasha sat down on the dark blue mattress and hugged her friend. With a big effort, Sonia struggled halfway up, wiped tears away, and began to talk. Nikolai's going away next week. His papers have come. He told me himself. I ought not to cry. She showed Natasha the sheet of paper she was holding in her hand. Poetry written by Nikolai. I know I ought not to cry, but you just can't. No one can understand. He's got such a lovely soul. And she burst into floods of tears again at the thought of how lovely his soul was. It's all right for you. I'm not jealous. I love you and Boris too, she said, pulling herself together a little. He's so nice. There's nothing to stop you. But Nikolai's my cousin. It would take the Archbishop, and they won't. So if anyone tells Mama... Sonia looked on the Countess as a mother and called her Mama, even though Sonia wasn't her daughter. She'll just say I'm running Nikolai's career. I'm heartless and ungrateful, but really, I swear to God, she made the sign of the cross, that I do love her. I love all of you, except Vera. What's wrong with her? What have I done to her? I really am grateful to you. I'd sacrifice anything for you, but there's nothing for me to... Sonia broke down again and buried her head in her hands in the mattress. Natasha was beginning to calm down, and her face showed that she grasped the full significance of her friend's distress. Man, they really hate Vera in this house. Even the people that aren't related to Vera hate her. Even her parents don't like her. I feel bad for her. Sonia, she snapped. She seemed to have guessed the real reason for her cousin's misery. Has Vera been talking to you since dinner? She has, hasn't she? Yes. It's these poems that Nikolai wrote himself, and I copied out some other poetry. And she found it all on my table and said she'd show it to Mama. And she said I was an ungrateful girl, and Mama would never let him marry me. And he wasn't going to marry Julie. And you've seen him all day with her. Oh, Natasha, why? And again she burst into tears more bitter than ever. Natasha pulled her up, gave her a hug, and started to comfort her, smiling through her own tears. Sonia, you mustn't believe her. Darling, you really mustn't. Do you remember us talking together in the sitting room, the three of us? You, me, and Nikolai. Do you remember? After supper. We worked everything out for the future. I can't quite remember how, but you remember everything was going to be all right and nothing would be impossible. Listen, Uncle Shinshin's brother is married to his cousin, and we're only second cousins. And Boris said it's definitely possible. You know, I told him everything. He's so clever and so good, said Natasha. Don't cry, Sonia. Lovely, sweet, darling Sonia. And she laughed as she kissed her. Vera's spiteful. Never mind her. Everything will be all right, and she won't tell Mama. Nikolai will tell her himself, and he's never even thought about Julie. And she kissed her on the top of her head. Sonia half rose, and the kitten in her revived, its eyes gleaming. It seemed ready to flick its tail, pounce about on its soft paws, and start playing with a ball, as good kittens do. What about bad kittens? Do you think so? No, you really... No, really, do you? She said rapidly, smoothing dress and hair. Yes, I really do, answered Natasha, tucking some straggling hair back into place on her friend's head, and they laughed together. All right, then let's go and sing the spring. Oh, wait. That was one sentence. All right, then let's go and sing the spring. Yes, let's. And you know that fat Pierre who sat opposite me? He's so funny, Natasha said suddenly, and she stopped. I'm having such a wonderful time, she shouted, and ran off down the corridor. Bad kittens bark. I suppose a bad kitten would bark. This kitten's malfunctioning. It's barking like a dog. Brushing the fluff off her dress and hiding the poetry in her bodice next to her throat and bony little chest, Sonia ran after Natasha with flushed face and light, happy steps down the corridor and into the sitting room. By popular request, the youngsters sang a quartet called The Spring, which everyone enjoyed. Then Nikolai sang a song he had just learnt by heart. There where the evening moonlight shimmers, how sweet and lovely to renew, and trust the happy hope that glimmers, for somewhere someone thinks of you. And she will strain her little fingers, and they the golden harp will strum, with harmony and love that lingers. She calls you, oh come, oh come. Though paradise will one day beckon, alas, your love will not be there. Before he could get to the end, out in the big hall, the young people started getting ready for the dancing, and the gallery musicians began stamping their feet and coughing. Pierre was sitting in the drawing room where Shinshin, knowing he was just back from abroad, came over and started up a conversation. Gosh, why can't I change the pages? About politics with Pierre, which Pierre found very boring. Others joined them. When the orchestra struck up, Natasha walked in, went straight up to Pierre, laughing and blushing, and said, Mama told me to ask you to dance. I'm afraid I can never get the figures right, said Pierre, but if you'll be my teacher. And he reached down to offer his big arm to the tiny little girl. While the couples were taking up their places and the band tuned up, Pierre sat down with his little lady. Natasha's happiness was complete. She was going to dance with a grown-up and with someone who had just come from abroad. She sat there for all to see and talked to him like a grown-up lady. In one hand she held a fan which a lady had given her to hold, posing like a real society lady. Heaven knows where and when she learnt all this. She spoke to her champion with much fluttering of the fan and many a glance over it. What is she doing? Just look at her, said the old countess, striding across the hall and pointing to Natasha. Her daughter blushed a little and gave a laugh. Well, Mama, why are you looking at me like that? What's so surprising? Yeah, what's so surprising, Mom? Halfway through this third Ecosier, is that the right way pronunciation for that word? There was a scraping of chairs in the sitting room, where the Count and Maria Dmitrievna had been playing cards with the more distinguished and older guests. And most of them stood up the stretch after sitting for so long before putting away their pocketbooks and purses and walking through to the ballroom. Maria Dmitrievna and the Count led the way, both looking very jolly. With flamboyant politeness and mincing like a ballet dancer, the Count crooked his arm and offered it to Maria Dmitrievna. Then he drew himself up, a dashing figure with a clever smile on his face, and as the Ecosier came to an end, he clapped his hands to the gallery musicians and called up to the leader, Simeon, can you play Daniel Cooper? This had been his favorite dance since the days of his youth, though properly speaking, the Daniel Cooper was one movement in the Anglais. In the Anglais? Grown-up dances. Grown-up dances. Not the children's kind. Not TikTok. This ain't TikTok. Russian TikTok. Watch Papa dance, Natasha shouted to the whole ballroom, completely forgetting that her partner was a grown-up, and her laughter rang through the room as her curly head went down to her knees. Everyone was indeed enjoying the sight of the jolly old gentleman and his rather tall partner, the majestic Maria Dmitrievna, as he linked arms with her to the rhythm of the music, put back his shoulders, tapped the floor with his turned-out toes, beaming ever more benevolently as his audience and whetting their appetite for what was to come. By the time the band had struck up with the rousing strains of the Daniel Cooper, a merry country dance in all but name, every doorway into the ballroom had become filled with the smiling faces of servants, men on one side and women on the other, as they piled in to watch the master enjoying himself. Get your flossing. No one flosses here. Where do you even get your dental floss in 1805? In one doorway stood the old nurse applauding the master in the traditional peasant manner, calling him our little father and our eagle. The Count was a good dancer and he knew it, but his lady couldn't dance at all and didn't want to. Her great big body stood stiffly and her sturdy arms dangled. She had handed her evening bag to the Countess. The only thing about her that did any dancing was her face, a nice mixture of grimness and beauty. Whereas the Count performed with the whole of his rotund form, Maria Dmitrievna did so with nothing more than a broadening smile and a slight quivering of the nose. The Count may have enchanted the audience with his ever-increasing energy, his amazingly nimble and gentle prancing and capering, but Maria Dmitrievna made no less impact with a mere twitch of the shoulders or the curving of an arm as they turned or halted to mark time, and her contribution was greatly admired in view of her stout figure and legendary dourness. Their dancing became more and more hectic. The opposite couple couldn't make any impression, nor did they try to. All eyes were on the Count, and Maria Dmitrievna. Natasha tugged at every sleeve and gown, urging everyone to watch Papa dancing, though that's what they were already doing. In any brief pauses that the Count gasped for breath and waved to the band, shouting to them to speed things up. Faster and faster he whirled, faster and nimbler than ever, rising on tiptoes, crashing down on his heels, swirling around his partner, and finally swinging her back into her place with one last flourish and a leg kicked up neatly behind him. Now he bowed a perspiring head, beamed at the company, and gave a huge sweep of his right arm to thunderous applause and much laughter, especially from Natasha. Both partners stood there, getting their breath back and mopping their faces with fine cambric handkerchiefs. Handkerchief. I never can say that word right. Handkerchief. That's the way we danced in our day, my dear, said the Count. Good for Daniel Cooper, said Maria Dmitrievna, taking a long, deep breath and tucking back her sleeves. Hammy kerchief. Yes. Chapter 18. At the moment when the Sixth Anglais was being danced in the Rostovs' hall to the badly timed strains of a weary orchestra, and exhausted cooks and waiters were getting supper ready, Count Bezukov suffered his sixth stroke. Oh, yikes. This is happening at the same time, and Pierre's partying there. Pierre is Count Bezukov's son. His, bastard son, as they put it. Well, what are you going to do? You're invited to a dinner party and your father's on his deathbed. You go to the dinner party. You dance with a 13-year-old girl. You eat dinner and be bored, I guess is what it sounds like. The doctors pronounced no hope of recovery. The sick man was given silent confession and holy communion, and last rites were prepared. As always on such occasions, there was much coming and going in the house and a dreadful air of expectancy. Outside, hordes of undertakers hid beyond the gates, avoiding any approaching carriages, but eagerly anticipating a nice fat order for the Count's funeral. The military governor of Moscow, who had sent a string of aides to inquire after the Count's condition, came in person that evening to take leave of this famous grandee of Catherine's court, Count Bezukov. The magnificent reception room was full. Everyone stood up respectfully when the governor emerged from the sick room after half an hour alone with the sick man. He gave a curt nod, and then made his escape as quickly as possible from the onlooking doctors, church dignitaries, and relatives. Prince Vasily, who had grown thinner and paler over recent days, escorted the governor out, whispering to him several times. After seeing him on his way, the prince sat down alone on a chair in the hall, crossed one leg high over the other, leant an elbow on his knee, and covered his eyes with his hand. He sat like that for some time and then got to his feet and hurried off faster than usual down the long corridor, looking around in some alarm and heading for the rear of the house and the eldest princess. Those left behind in the dimly lit room murmured occasionally in hushed tones, but all paused and watched with intense interest whenever the door to the dying man's room creaked open as someone went in or out. The human span, said a little old man, some sort of cleric, to a lady who had come to sit by him and was now listening naively to everything he said. That span is determined and may not be exceeded. I was wondering whether it might be too late for the last rites, inquired the lady, using his clerical title, herself apparently devoid of any opinion on this matter. It is all a great mystery, madam, answered the cleric. stroking his bald head with its few thin strands of graying hair combed across. What? Did I hear you say the governor's been here? Someone asked at the other end of the room. Doesn't look his age, does he? No, he's over 60. I gather the Count can't recognize anyone. Are they still giving him the last rites? I knew a man who had the last rites 7 times. The second princess emerged from the sick room with tears in her eyes and sat next to Dr. Lorraine, who had arranged himself in a pose under a portrait of Catherine the Great and was leaning against the table. It's a very nice day, said the doctor in reply to a question about the weather. A very nice day, princess, but then being in Moscow is just like being in the country. Is it really? Said the princess with a sigh. Now, can we give him anything to drink? Lorraine paused for reflection. Has he had his medicine? Yes. The doctor consulted his watch. Take a glass of boiled water and add a pinch of cream of tartar. His delicate fingers showed her what a pinch meant. He's mansplaining to her. This is a pinch. Okay? Cream of tartar and water used to do that? What does it do? Like help your stomach or something? There is never been a case, said a German doctor to an adjutant in his broken Russian, that anybody lived in after their third stroke. Lived on after their third stroke. That's what he said. I had to translate it. Intermittent fasting. Oh, interesting. And didn't he look after himself? Said the adjutant. And who's going to inherit all this? He added in a whisper. The customers will come, smiled the German in reply. The door creaked and everyone turned. It was the second princess, who had made up the drink prescribed by the doctor and was now taking it in. The German doctor went over to Lorraine. Can he hold out until tomorrow morning? Asked the German, speaking French with a ghastly accent. Lorraine pursed his lips and wagged a stern finger in front of his nose to say no. During the night at the latest, said softly, with a courteous smile of smug confidence in his unique ability to interpret and transmit the precise condition of his patient so clearly. Then he stood up and walked away. Meanwhile, Prince Vasily had opened the door of the princess's room, which was in semi-darkness with only 2 small lamps burning before the icons. There was a pleasing scent of incense and flowers. The room was filled with small pieces of furniture, tiny knickknacks, bookcases and tables. White covers on a high feather bed were just visible behind a screen. A little dog yapped. Is that you, cousin? She got up and smoothed her hair, which was always, even now, so extraordinarily smooth that it seemed to have been made out of one piece, along with her head and given a coat of gloss. Has anything happened? She asked. You startled me. No, nothing has changed. I've just dropped in for a little chat, Katish, about business. Katish? I want to say I'm pronouncing this wrong, but I might not be. Said the prince, sinking wearily into the low chair from which she had just got up. Oh, it's quite warm in here, he said. Come and sit down, let's talk. I was just wondering whether anything had happened, said the princess. And with that perpetually stony look on her prim face, she sat down opposite the prince, ready to listen. I have been trying to get some sleep, cousin, but I can't. Well now, my dear, said Prince Vasily, taking the princess's hand and pressing it downwards as he often did. This little phrase clearly touched on things that both of them knew but neither spoke of. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Well now, my dear, said Prince Vasily, taking the princess's hand and pressing it downwards as he often did. This little phrase clearly touched on things that both of them knew but neither spoke of. The princess, with her spare, rigid body, too long for her legs. Oh yeah, her body that was longer than her legs. Remember that from last week? Kind of this bizarre creature. Looked straight at the prince with no sign of emotion in her prominent gray eyes. She shook her head and looked round at the icons with a sigh. This movement might not have been interpreted as an expression of sorrow and devotion, or perhaps one of weariness and the hope for a speedy release. Prince Viceley opted for weariness. Do you imagine it's any easier for me? He said. I'm as worn out as a post horse. But I must speak to you, Katish. Katish, I gotta look up how to. I'm gonna be. Oh, here's cousin.
Peter Nikolaevich Shinshin.
Her name. I'm just gonna have to call her Katish. That's her name now. um, Katish is Pierre's cousin, also related to Count Bezukov, who's dying. Lady Katisha. um, I'm as worn out as a post horse, but I must speak to you, Katish. It's something serious. Prince Vasily broke off, and his cheeks began to twitch nervously, first on one side, then on the other, giving his face an unpleasant look the like of which was never seen when he was in a drawing room. His eyes, too, were different. They either stared out with a kind of crude humor in them, or they darted about furtively. The princess held her lapdog with her thin, dry hands, staring closely at Prince Vasily, and it was soon obvious that she was not going to break the silence, if she had to sit there till morning. Well, it's like this, my dear princess and cousin. Katerina Semyonovna, said Prince Vasily, clearly struggling to continue. At times like this, one must think of everything. We must think about the future, about you. I love all of you as I love my own children. You know that. The princess looked at him with the same fixed, inscrutable gaze. But when all's said and done, we have to think of my family too, continued Prince Vasily, petulantly shoving away a little table while avoiding her eyes. You know, Katish, that you three Mamatov sisters and my wife are the only direct heirs of the Count. I know, I know. It is distressing for you to speak and think about such things. I don't find it any easier, but, my dear, I'm over 50 now, and I must be ready for anything. Did you know I had sent for Pierre, and that the Count pointed to his portrait and asked to see him? Prince Vasily looked inquiringly at the princess, but he couldn't work out whether she was absorbing what he had said, or just looking at him. Cousin, I pray constantly for one thing only, she replied. That God may have mercy on his noble soul as he departs this. Yes, yes, Prince Vasily went on impatiently, wiping his bald head and angrily pulling back the table he had just shoved away. But as things stand, well, the point is this. I'm sure you know that last winter the Count made a will which bypassed his direct heirs, including us, and left all his estate to Pierre. He must have made lots of wills, the princess said placidly, but he couldn't leave everything to Pierre. Pierre is illegitimate. My dear cousin, he snapped, clutching the table in his growing excitement and hurrying his words. What if a letter had been written by the Count to the Emperor, asking for permission to adopt Pierre as his legitimate son? You must realize that the Count's service would mean that his request would be granted. The princess smiled, as people do when they think they know more than the person they are talking to. I'll go further, said Prince Vasily, taking her hand. That letter has been written, and although it was never sent, the Emperor knows of its existence. The only question is, has it been destroyed or not? If not, when it's all over, Prince Vasily sighed, giving her a chance to see what he meant by the words, all over. And they go through the Count's papers. The will and the letter will be given to the Emperor together, and his request will probably be granted. As the legitimate son, Pierre will get everything. What about our share? Asked the princess with a twisted smile, as if anything could happen, only not that. Why, my poor Katish, it's as clear as daylight. He will then be the sole legal heir to everything, and you won't get a thing. You must surely know, my dear, whether the will and the letter were written, and whether or not they were destroyed. And if by any chance they have been mislaid, then you ought to know where they are, and be able to find them, because now you have gone too far. The princess interrupted with a sardonic smile and no change in the expression of her eyes. I'm a woman, and you think we're all stupid. But I do know this. An illegitimate son cannot inherit. He is a bastard, she added, the last word in French, as if its use would demonstrate the flaw in his thinking. Catiche, you really don't seem to understand. If you're that intelligent, why can't you see that if the Count has written to the Emperor asking for recognition of Pierre as legitimate, he won't be Pierre anymore. He'll be Count Bezikov, and he'll inherit everything under the will. And if the will and the letter have not been destroyed, then, apart from the consolation of having done your duty and all the rest of it, you are left with nothing, and that's a fact. I do know the will was made, but I also know that it is invalid. You seem to take me for a complete fool, my dear cousin, said the princess with the air of a woman who has come out with something clever and scathing. My dear Princess Katerina Semyonovna? Semyonovna. My dear Princess Katerina Semyonovna, Prince Vasily was losing patience. This character now. No, it's the same. It's the same character, just as a different spelling. I'm talking to you as a relative. Okay, let me start this over. My dear Princess Katerina Semyonovna, Prince Vasily was losing patience. I haven't come here just to annoy you. I'm talking to you as a relative, a good, kind, true relative, about your own interests. I am telling you for the umpteenth time that if that letter to the Emperor and the will made out in Pierre's favor are still among the Count's papers, neither you, my dear girl, nor your sisters are heiresses. If you don't believe me, you must believe other people who know about these things. I've just been talking to Dmitri Onufrich, the family solicitor, and he says the same thing. A sudden and obvious change now came over the princess's train of thought. Her thin lips paled, though her eyes stayed the same, and when she spoke, her voice seemed to come out more thunderously than she was expecting. That would be a fine thing, she said. I wanted nothing, and I still want nothing. She pushed the dog down from her lap and smoothed out the folds of her skirt. There's gratitude for you. That's what you get for sacrificing everything, she said. Wonderful. Splendid. I have no need of anything, Prince. Yes, but it's not just you. You have two sisters, answered Prince Vasily, but the princess was not listening. Yes, I've always known, but I had forgotten that in this house I can never expect anything but unfairness, deceit, jealousy, and double-dealing. Only ingratitude, the blackest ingratitude. Do you or do you not know where that will is? Prince Vasily insisted, his cheeks twitching more than ever. Oh yes, I've been stupid. I've kept faith with people, given them my love, and sacrificed everything. But you can't succeed nowadays without being mean and horrible. I know who's been double-dealing. The princess was about to stand up, but the prince held her back by the arm. She had the air of someone who has suddenly lost faith in the whole human race. She glared at him malevolently. There is still time, my dear. Remember, Catiche, this was an accident. Something done in a moment of anger, of illness, and then forgotten. Our duty, my dear, is to correct his mistake, to relieve him in his last moments by not letting him commit this injustice, not letting him die with the thought that he has brought unhappiness to people who have sacrificed everything for him, the princess responded. She made another effort to get up, but the prince restrained her. A sacrifice he's never been able to appreciate. No cousin, she added with a sigh. I shall remember that there are no rewards in this world, that in this world there is no honor or justice. In this world, you need to be clever and wicked. Well, we shall see. Don't upset yourself. I know your noble heart. No, I have a wicked heart. I know your heart, repeated the prince. I value your friendship, and I would like you to think the same of me. So don't upset yourself and let's talk sensibly together while there is still time, whether it's a whole day or just an hour. Tell me everything you know about that will. The most important thing is, where is it? You must know. We'll take it to the Count and show it to him. He's probably forgotten all about it, and he'll want it destroyed. Please understand that my sole desire is to carry out his wishes religiously. That's what I came here for. I am here only to be of service to him and to you. Oh, I see. Oh, I see. Okay. Where was I? Where was I? Where was I? Oh, I see. Now I know. The phone brought me back from Russia. Okay. How's that? Okay. Don't you oh, I see. Now I know who's doing the double dilling. Yes, I know, said the princess. You've got it wrong, my dear. It's that Anna Mikhailovna, your lovely protege. I wouldn't have her as a housemaid. Ghastly, horrible woman. Please, we're wasting time. Don't you talk to me. Last winter she wormed her way in here and told the Count so many rotten, terrible things about all of us, especially Sophie. I can't repeat them. That it made the Count ill, and for 2 weeks he refused to see us. I'm sure that was when he wrote that awful, dreadful document, but I thought it didn't matter. There we have it. Why didn't you tell me? Instead of replying, the princess said, It's in that inlaid portfolio that he keeps under his pillow. I can see it all now. If I have one sin on my conscience, it is a big one. I loathe that vile woman. She was a different woman, virtually shrieking. And why does she come crawling in here? I'll give her a piece of my mind. My time will come. End of chapter 18. I might cut the stream. Yeah, it's going down. Princess is not pleased about having the will influenced by someone else. Let's see how long this next chapter is. It's not that long. These are pretty long chapters, though. While these conversations were taking place in the reception room and in the princess's room, a carriage was bringing Pierre, who had been sent for, and Anna Mikhailovna, who had found it necessary to come along too. This woman kind of is intolerable. Into the courtyard of Count Bezukhov's house. As the carriage wheels crunched softly over the straw laid down beneath the windows, Anna Mikhailovna turned consolingly to her companion, only to find him asleep in his corner of the carriage. She woke him up. It just changed song. Okay. Uh Anna Mikhailovna turned consolingly to her companion, only to find him asleep in his corner of the carriage. She woke him up. Pierre roused himself and followed Anna Mikhailovna out of the carriage, and only then turned his mind to the impending visit to his dying father. He noticed that they had not come to the main entrance, but had gone round to the back door. As he got down from the carriage, the two men dressed like tradesmen scurried away from the doorway into the shadow of the wall. Pausing for a moment, he could just make out several other similar figures standing in the shadows on both sides of the house. But Anna Mikhailovna, the servant, and the coachman, who must have seen these men, simply ignored them. So Pierre decided all was as it should be and followed her in. Anna Mikhailovna hurried up the badly lit narrow stone staircase, calling for Pierre not to lag behind. He couldn't see why he had to visit the Count at all, still less why they had to use the back stairs, but Anna Mikhailovna's confident manner and sense of urgency made him think it must be absolutely necessary. Halfway up the steps, they were almost knocked off their feet by some men who came clumping down towards them in big boots, carrying buckets, but who squeezed back against the wall to let Pierre and Anna Mikhailovna pass by, and didn't seem the least bit surprised to see them there. "Is this the way to the prince's apartments?" Anna Mikhailovna asked one of them. "Yes, madam," answered a footman in a loud, strong voice, as though anything were now permissible. "The door on the left." "Perhaps the Count didn't really ask for me," said Pierre, as he reached the landing. "I think I ought to go to my own room." Anna Mikhailovna waited for him to catch up. "Ah, my friend." Waited for him to catch up. "Ah, my friend," she said, touching his arm, just as she had touched her son's arm that morning. "Believe me, I am suffering as much as you, but be a man." "Really? Hadn't I better go?" Pierre asked, peering amiably at her over his spectacles. Amiably? My friend, forget the wrongs that may have been done to you. Keep thinking this is your father, and perhaps in his death agony," she sighed, "I took to you, and I've loved you like a son. Trust me, Pierre, I shall not forget your interests." Pierre couldn't understand a word of this, but he sensed even more strongly that all was as it should be, so he meekly followed Anna Mikhailovna, who was already opening a door into the back stairs vestibule. In one corner sat one of the princess's old manservants, knitting a stocking. Pierre had never been in this part of the house and hadn't even suspected the existence of these rooms. A maid went past carrying a tray with a decanter on it, and Anna Mikhailovna, calling her "my dear" and "good girl," inquired after the princess's health, and then took Pierre on down the stone-flagged corridor. The first door on the left led through the princess's living quarters. The maid with the decanter was in such a hurry, everything in the house seemed to be done in a hurry just then, that she didn't close the door behind her. Pierre and Anna Mikhailovna, in passing, happened to glance into the room where the eldest princess and Prince Vasily were in close conversation. Seeing them go by, Prince Vasily fell back in his chair with a gesture of irritation, but the princess leapt to her feet and in sheer desperation slammed the door with all her might and put the bolt on. This action was so out of character for the princess, with her perpetual serenity, and the shock on Prince Vasily's face was so out of tune with his dignity, that Pierre stopped in his tracks and gave a bewildered look at his guide over his spectacles. But Anna Mikhailovna, showing no surprise, gave a thin smile and sighed, as if to indicate that this was just what she had expected. "Be a man, my friend. I shall be looking after your interests," she said in response to his glance, and quickened her pace down the corridor. Pierre still couldn't understand what was going on, and he had even less idea of what was meant by looking after his interests. But he did gather one thing. Everything was as it should be. The corridor brought them into the half-lit hall just off the Count's reception room. This was one of the cold, magnificently furnished rooms that Pierre normally entered from the main staircase. But even here, there was an empty bath in the middle of the room, and water had been splashed on the carpet. Tiptoeing in their direction came a servant and a deacon with a censer, who ignored them. They went on into the reception room, which Pierre knew well, with its 2 Italian windows and a door into the winter garden, its large bust and full-length portrait of Catherine the Great. The same people were still sitting there in almost the same positions, whispering. Everyone paused and looked around at Anna Mikhailovna as she came in with her pale, tear-stained face, and at the large, stout figure of Pierre, who trailed along meekly in her wake, hanging his... "Hey, creature, welcome. How's it going? How are you tonight?" looks like my delivery has come, so I'll be right back, y'all. Give me just a minute. I'm back. Okay. The Count's about to die. Um... What I order? Groceries. No, the Rostovs are having a dance. Now, Pierre has to break away from the party because he's been summoned to his dying father's bedside. And Anna Mikhailovna, busybody woman that she is, has joined him because she has ulterior motives. I haven't quite figured out what that is, but I think it has something to do with her son, Boris. Anna Mikhailovna's face betrayed her awareness that the moment of crisis had arrived. With her Petersburg businesswoman's air, she strode into the room even more assertively than in the morning, keeping Pierre close by her. Since she was bringing the person the dying man wanted to see, she felt sure of a warm welcome for herself. With a rapid glance, she took it in the whole room, and particularly the presence of the Count's spiritual advisor. Without actually bowing, she seemed somehow to shrink into herself before gliding slowly over to the priest and reverently offering herself for a blessing to the two ecclesiastics, one after the other. "Thank God we are in time," she said to the priest. "We are family, and we have been terribly worried. This young man is the Count's son," she added more softly. "This is a dreadful time." This said, she went over to the doctor. "Dear doctor," she said to him, "this young man is the Count's son. Is there any hope at all?" Without speaking, the doctor gave a quick shrug and rolled his eyes upwards. With precisely the same gesture, Anna Mikhailovna shrugged and looked upwards, almost closing her eyes. Then, with a sigh, she walked away from the doctor and went back to Pierre. She addressed him with particular respect and sad solemnity. "Have faith in his mercy," she said to him, and indicating a small sofa for him to sit on and wait, she went soundlessly over to the door that all the eyes were on. It opened almost inaudibly, and she slid through as it closed behind her. Pierre, having decided to obey his guide in everything, went over towards the sofa she had pointed to. The moment Anna Mikhailovna disappeared, he noticed the eyes of everyone in the room turning towards him, with something more than curiosity and sympathy. He noticed they were all talking in whispers, looking across at him with something like a mixture of awe and sycophancy. They showed him the kind of respect he had never seen before. A lady, quite unknown to him, stopped talking to the priest, got to her feet, and offered him a seat. An adjutant picked up a glove that Pierre had dropped and handed it back to him. The doctors fell into a polite silence when he passed by and stood aside for him. Pierre's first desire was to sit somewhere else so as not to disturb the lady, to pick up the glove himself and to go round the doctors, who weren't in his way at all, but suddenly he realized that to do so would be improper. He realized that tonight he had become a special person, obliged to endure some ghastly ceremony because it was expected of him, and this meant he was bound to accept favors from everyone. He took the glove from the adjutant in silence, sat down in the lady's place, spreading out his big hands symmetrically on his knees and posing innocently like some Egyptian statue, and then made up his mind that all was as it should be, and that to avoid losing his head and doing stupid things tonight, he must not act on his own initiative, but bend wholly to the will of those who were guiding him. In a couple of minutes, Prince Vasily marched into the room, majestic in his coat with the 3 stars on it, and carrying his head high. He seemed to have grown thinner since the morning. His eyes seemed wider than usual as he glanced around the room and picked out Pierre. He came across and took his hand, something he had never done before, pressing it downwards as if he wanted to test the strength of its grip. Do take courage, my friend. He had asked to see you. That's a good thing. He made as if to leave, but Pierre felt a need to ask something. How is, he hesitated, undecided whether it was proper for him to call the dying man the Count, but embarrassed to call him father. He had another stroke half an hour ago. Do take courage, my friend. Pierre was in such a confused state of mind that the word stroke made him think of a blow from some heavy body. He looked nonplussed at Prince Vasily, and it was some time before he realized that a stroke is an illness. Prince Vasily said a few words to Lorraine in passing and tiptoed out. He was not very adept at tiptoeing, and his whole body jerked and twitched awkwardly. He was followed by the eldest princess, then by the clergy, and the deacons. A few servants also went out. Beyond the door, people could be heard moving about, and before long Anna Mikhailovna ran out, her face still pale but resolute in doing her duty. She touched Pierre on the arm and said, God's goodness is inexhaustible. The last rites are beginning. Come with me. Pierre went in, and as he trod the soft carpet, he noticed that the adjutant and the unknown lady, and even one or two servants came trooping in too, as if it was no longer necessary to ask permission to enter that room. Chapter 20. Pierre knew it well as this huge room divided by columns and an arch and the floor covered with Persian carpets. That part of the room beyond the columns, where a high mahogany bedstead with silk hangings stood on one side, and with a huge stand and many icons on the other, was lit up with a bright red light, like a church prepared for evening service. Under the ornamental icon covering stood a deep Voltaire armchair, and in it Pierre saw, propped up on snow-white, uncrumpled, freshly changed pillows, and covered waist-high with a bright green quilt, a familiar and majestic figure, his father, Count Bezúkhov, slumping there with a familiar gray lion's mane over his broad brow, and the typically aristocratic lines deeply etched into a handsome, reddish-yellow face. He lay there immediately under the icons with his big thick arms at rest on the quilt. In his right hand, palm down, a wax candle had been thrust between thumb and forefingers and was being held in place by an old servant bending over him from behind. Around the chair hovered the churchmen with their long hair trailing down over splendid, glittering vestments. Holding lighted candles in their hands, they were performing their offices with unhurried solemnity. Just behind them stood the two younger princesses, clutching handkerchiefs and intermittently dabbing their eyes, and in front of them the eldest, Lady Katisha. A picture of spiteful determination kept her eyes glued on the icons, as though declaring to all and sundry that she wouldn't answer for the consequences if she were to look away from them. Anna Mikhailovna, all meekness, sorrowfulness, and forgiveness, stood near the door with the unknown lady. Prince Vasily was standing beside the invalid chair on the other side of the door. He had drawn up a carved velvet chair and was resting his left hand on its back, holding a candle, and using his right hand to cross himself, rolling his eyes upward every time he put his fingers to his forehead. His face conveyed gentle piety and resignation to the will of God. If you cannot understand feelings like these, his face seemed to say, that's too bad for you. Behind him stood the adjutant, the doctors, and the men servants. The men and the women had separated as in church. They all made the sign of the cross in silence, and the only sounds came from the holy reading, the subdued, deep bass chanting, and in moments of silence from some sighing and the shuffling of feet. With a meaningful air which showed... Laconic Granny is the song that's gonna play right when I'm reading this part. I remember last week the song came out the right time. Now it's like coming out that a death scene. It's like, really? Right when the Count's dying? You're gonna do Laconic Granny. Da 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 da. They all made the sign of the cross in silence, and the only sounds came from the holy reading, the subdued, deep bass chanting, and a moments of silence from some sighing and the shuffling of feet. With a meaningful air which showed she knew what she was doing, Anna Mikhailovna walked across the room to Pierre and handed him a candle. He lit it, but was then so busy watching the people around him that he used the hand holding the candle to cross himself. The youngest princess, Sophie, the rosy-cheeked one with the mole and the sense of humor, had her eyes on him. She smiled, hid her face in her handkerchief, and kept it there for some time, but soon looked at Pierre again and gave another giggle. He was obviously incapable of looking at him without giggling, but she couldn't resist looking at him, so she removed the temptation by gliding behind a column. In mid-service, the voices of the priests suddenly ceased, and they started whispering to one another. The old servant who was holding the count's hand straightened up and turned to the ladies. Anna Mikhailovna stepped forward, bent down over the sick man, and beckoned behind her back to Lorraine. The French doctor had been standing there without a candle, leaning against a column, but with the respectful attitude of a foreigner who, despite differences of religion, fully acknowledges the solemnity of the ceremony and even approves of it. Now, with the noiseless steps of a man in his prime, he strode over to his patient, extended delicate white fingers to raise a hand from the quilt, turned to one side and began feeling the pulse thoughtfully. They gave the sick man something to drink. A few people around him stirred, then they all went back to their places, and the service continued. During this break in the proceedings, Pierre watched. Prince Vasily leave his chair back, and with the same air of authority, he knew what he was doing, and it was too bad for anyone who couldn't understand him. He walked straight past the sick man and joined the eldest princess. Together they went off to the far end of the room towards the high bedstead with its silk hangings. They went past the bed and out through a rear door, but before the end of the service they came back in one after the other and resumed their places. Pierre paid no more attention to this development than to any other, having made up his mind once and for all that tonight everything unfolding before him was necessary and inevitable. So I'm guessing Prince Vasily and the elder princes are going to go look for that will so they can destroy it. Oh wow, we've actually made quite a bit of progress through this book. I'm actually surprised. Huh. What do you know? The sound of chanting stopped, and the priest's voice could be heard reverently congratulating the sick man on having received the mystery. The patient lay there, showing no sign of life or movement. Round about him there was a shuffling and a rustling, and voices whispering. Anna Mikhailovna's louder than the rest. Pierre heard her say, "Yes, he must be moved across to the bed. It's impossible here." The sick man was now so hemmed in by doctors, princesses, and servants that Pierre could no longer see the reddish-yellow face with the gray mane that he had never for a moment lost sight of during the ceremony, even though there had been other faces to watch as well. From the gingerly maneuvering of people around the chair, he surmised that they were lifting the dying man up and moving him over to the bed. "Hold on to my arm or you'll drop him," he heard one of the servants whisper in panic. "Down a bit. Somebody else here," said voices. Labored breathing, heavy steps, and a gathering rush made it seem as if the weight they were carrying was too much for them. The bearers struggled past Anna Mikhailovna among them, and the young man caught a glimpse over their backs and necks of the sick man. The fleshy expanse of his huge chest, the curling gray of his leonine head, and the massive shoulders, all hunched up as people grasped him under the armpits. That head, with its broad brow and prominent cheekbones, a handsome, sensual mouth with an aloof expression of high dignity, was not disfigured by the approach of death. It was the same head that Pierre remembered from 3 months ago when his father had seen him off to Petersburg, but now it flopped about helplessly to the stumbling steps of the bearers, and the cold, apathetic eyes were focused on nothing. For Pierre? No. Wait, what about for Pierre, Kev? His illegitimacy. I guess according to the law back then, because he's illegitimate, he can't inherit everything from the dad, from his father. But unless he got special permission from the emperor, which apparently he wrote a new will and got asked for special permission to officially adopt his bastard son so that his son could inherit his property. Prince Visely and the princess, the older cousin, are going to go find where that will is so they can destroy it before it's found and recorded. And that letter, the will and that letter, because they feel or believe that they will be kicked out of whatever new will there is or something. Pierre is just kind of like going along with the flow. He's just there. He's had to go along with the flow his entire life as being an illegitimate son. After a few minutes commotion around the high bed, the bearers went back to their places. Anna Mikhailovna touched Pierre's arm and said, "Come with me." The two of them approached the bed on which the sick man had been laid in some style, perhaps to accord with the mystery that had just been enacted. He was laying with his head propped up on high pillows, his hands symmetrically spread, palms down on the green silk quilt. When Pierre came up, the Count looked straight at him, but with a gaze unintelligible to mortal man in its purpose and significance. Either these eyes said nothing at all, but they simply stared because they had nothing to look, or because they had to look at something, or else they said too much. Either these eyes said nothing at all, but simply stared because they had to look at something, or else they said too much. Pierre stopped, not knowing what he ought to do, and turned to his guide for help. Anna Mikhailovna looked at him, motioning quickly with her eyes towards the sick man's hand and using her lips to float down a kiss. Pierre got the message, thrusting his neck forward with a great effort to avoid getting caught in the quilt, and kissing the solid, broad hand. Nothing stirred, neither the hand itself nor any muscle on the Count's face. Again Pierre sought guidance from Anna Mikhailovna as to what to do next. Her eyes indicated an armchair beside the bed. Meekly, Pierre made as if to sit down in it, his eyes still wondering whether he was doing the right thing. Anna Mikhailovna nodded approvingly. Pierre resumed his innocent, symmetrical pose as an Egyptian statue, obviously ruining the fact that his big, clumsy body took up so much space, and doing his utmost mentally to reduce himself in size. He looked at the Count. The Count still gazed ahead at where Pierre's face had been when he had stood before him. Anna Mikhailovna's attitude acknowledged all the pathos and significance of this last meeting between father and son. It lasted 2 minutes, but they seemed like an hour to Pierre. Suddenly a tremor passed over the big muscles and deep lines on the Count's face. The shudder intensified, and the handsome mouth was contorted. It was now that Pierre realized how near death his father was, and from the contorted mouth came a hoarse wheeze. Anna Mikhailovna looked anxiously into the sick man's eyes, trying to work out what he wanted. She pointed at Pierre, then at a drink, then in a whispered question she mentioned the name of Prince Visely. Then she pointed to the quilt. The sick man's eyes and face registered some impatience. He made a great effort to look around at the servant, immovable at the head of the bed. "His Excellency wishes to be turned over onto his other side," whispered the servant, and he got up to turn the Count's heavy body towards the wall. Pierre stood up to help. While the Count was being turned over, one of his arms got caught helplessly behind him, and he made a vain attempt to drag it back. Whether or not the Count noticed the horror with which Pierre stared at that lifeless arm, or whether some other idea flashed through his dying mind at that instant, he looked down at his unresponsive arm, then at the expression of horror on Pierre's face, then back at his arm, and finally his face produced a smile which jarred with his fine features, a pathetically weak smile that seemed to mock his own helplessness. Suddenly, at the sight of that smile, Pierre felt a shudder in his chest and a prickling in his nose, and his eyes clouded over with tears. They finished turning the sick man towards the wall. He gave a sigh. "He's having a little doze," said Anna Mikhailovna, noticing that one of the princesses was coming to take her turn by the bedside. "Let's go." Pierre went out. Chapter 21! Okay, see how long this chapter is. Well, I thought we would finish Volume 1, Part 1 by the end of this day, or the end of this stream, but I don't think I'm going to. It's still quite a bit to go. So what I might do is just call the stream for tonight. We're going to end at chapter 21. Count Bezikov is still hanging on by a thread, I guess. I thought he was going to just kick the bucket today. Anyways, thank you all so much for joining me tonight. And tomorrow night I'll start my visual novel playthrough. It'll be Ace Attorney, starting at about 8 o'clock. And yeah. Remember. So we're doing really well. We're gonna make it through this book by the end of the year. Guarantee it. Billy, welcome. How's it going? You just caught the end of my reading stream. But I'll be back tomorrow night. That being said, thank you all so much for watching. I will see you all either tomorrow or next Monday. Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Creature. Thank you, everyone else who stopped by. Ace, if you're still around. And yeah. All time.